Good day to you. Welcome to another episode of Fighting Men of Rhodesia on our YouTube series. My guest today is Edward Ostrosky from the United States, who was in Vietnam, came to Rhodesia, we'll hear why, and was a tracker in multiple units and national parks, and thereafter in South Africa, had a lot to do with the wildlife and the establishment of some game reserves. So I think this is going to be a very interesting story. We haven't had many Americans. But I just love American audiences and people that we have spoken to. There's an affinity between our nations and fighting men of all countries. We have something in common. So Ed, welcome to the show. You are down there in South Africa, in just around the Pietermaritzburg, did you say?
Yes, I'm in Howick, just outside Pietermaritzburg.
Right. Yeah, it's a good place to live. Most of my family are down there. And tell us about yourself. Where were you born and raised, and how did you end up in Vietnam, Ed?
Well, I was born in Pennsylvania, sort of in a little coal mining town. And in 1956, my father decided to make a move, and we moved to Florida and eventually settled in the Cape Canaveral area, just near the missile testing range, where he was a security policeman. So I spent my younger years running around in the mangrove swamps and the kind of pine flats and palmettos, playing soldier and watching the missile testing tests go off, and sometimes successfully and sometimes just with a big bang. So it was quite an exciting place to live as a kid, and there was a real purpose to things, and everybody was working for the space program, first of all in a military sense, and then in the space race, getting to the moon.
You coming from Pennsylvania immediately rings bells in my mind of the deer hunter and all the guys working in the steel mills, and then being called up to Vietnam. Does that ring a bell with you, or is it too Hollywood?
Well, I've seen that, and kind of the bleakness and things were captured pretty well. And I think one of the best thing my father did for us was to make the move away from there, because I probably would have gravitated into the mines, and then when they closed, been out of a job, and probably not had that great of a future. So going to Florida and being in a kind of an undeveloped environment for many years, because it was still a wild and woolly place. It took a long time for the infrastructure and facilities to catch up with the number of people coming in to actually the aerospace engineers and things working on the programs.
So you must have been fairly wildlife and bush orientated just from that experience, would you say?
Yes, well, I was very interested in wildlife. Not that we had a lot around compared to Africa. I mean, there were some alligators, there were some rattlesnakes, water moccasins, things like that. But the deer and other bigger wildlife had most have been poached out of the areas on Merritt Island, where we lived. But the northern part, of course, became the Kennedy Space Center, where the moonshot launches were made, and that is a nature reserve. That's a whole wildlife area now.
Did you see many of those launches, apart from the missile test site? Did you see many of the spaceships go up?
Yes, well, it saw most of them for my younger years. We'd be in school and hear this rumble, and somebody would shout missile, and the teacher would say, "Okay, you can go out," and we'd all watch. And sometimes you'd see the smoke trail and the glow, and sometimes they'd blow up, and sometimes they'd streak off downrange. And I was lucky enough to see things like the first man shot from my junior high school sports fields, and all of those early ones until I entered the military, and then actually made it back, and I was there, was home on leave when the Apollo 11 landed on the moon.
Wonderful. And the entrance into the military, was that voluntary or were you called up?
Well, unlike most of my friends, because I was surfing and scuba diving and things like that, and most of my friends were trying to dodge the draft, in one way or another. But with my father's background in the military, he had been in Panama before the World War II in the old horse and mule pack artillery, and then been with the Third Armored Division throughout World War II into Germany. And it never occurred to me that I wouldn't serve in some capacity. Um, Considering that I was on the coast and very interested in the water, it's surprising I didn't get in the Navy or the Coast Guard, but I I was a I was a born infantryman, a born grunt, just as we called them in Vietnam.
Did you have any did you have any choice going into the Navy if you called up? Did you, or was it they sent you where you had to go and that was it?
Well, if you were drafted, you went into the Army, and later they actually drafted some people into the Marine Corps. But to get into the Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force, you had to volunteer and sign up for that
Hmm.
and hope they accepted you.
Hmm.
In my case, I was a shoe-in to the Army because I'd grown up when the Korean War was still going, and so the Reds were the enemy,
Hmm.
and never thought of not being a soldier really, and even if it was just temporarily.
And
So
where did you do your training? Was it Fort Bragg, one of the other ones?
I signed up as regular Army for 3 years, and when I did my basic at Fort Benning, advanced infantry training, which was airborne infantry, at Fort Gordon, Georgia. Then went back to Fort Benning, where I was medically disqualified from airborne training because of some stress fractures in my feet. But when they healed up, they still thought I was good infantry material and sent me off to a non-commissioned officers course. And yeah, so I spent basically a year in training before being deployed to Vietnam.
Hmm. And what did they look for to say that you were the right type of person? Was it academic, your attitude, your environment that you grew up in? What were they looking for?
Well, that remains a mystery because I've been offered initially the chance to go to officers candidate school, which I've turned down. But I must say, I went into the army at 17, and with my background, I had never been a leader of men, never kind of been the captain of a sports team, anything. I didn't have too many leadership bones in my body at that stage. So I was kind of well suited to be, uh, well, as I got out of the non-commissioned officers course as a specialist fourth class, which was roughly uh, comparable to corporal, but without the perks.
And so you finished your training. What was your first posting in Vietnam?
Well, that's after leave. I was sent to Vietnam in July of 1968, just after the Tet Offensive. And after the unit I was sent to join had just been mauled quite badly in some joint operations with the Marines up on the DMZ. They were defending one of the provincial capitals. I think it was Dong Ha, and yeah, so they took a lot of strain up there from North Vietnamese artillery and kind of massed assaults and things like that. And well, I was one of the replacements.
Wow, so that was static warfare you were involved in, sort of in fire bases and that type of thing.
I joined the 3rd, the 21st of the 196 Light Infantry, and as I say, I was grunt material. They just put everything on your back and you walked off the fire base, and you patrolled, and then eventually you usually walked back. But we had 3 fire support bases in our tactical operations area, just imaginatively called East, West, and Center. and those each had a battery of 105 millimeter howitzers, mortars, and things like that, sport weapons, and were designed to be mutually supportive um, if they got into trouble. And we were in a free fire zone. Most of it was a free fire zone, anyhow, where any military-aged male could be shot on sight. And he mostly fought North Vietnamese regulars rather than the Viet Cong, who were more out to the flatlands and in the more populated areas.
I think the fire base concept would have been wonderful for Rhodesia as well, but we just didn't have the manpower. I mean, America could bring in thousands of guns, and we just had, I think, 40 artillery pieces. So this mutual supporting firing from hilltops just couldn't happen. But what was the mental attitude of the guys, both regular and draftees? Were they happy to fight in Vietnam? Did you see it as a waste of time? What the hell am I doing here?
I must admit, from the beginning, when you arrived there, landed on a fire support base, and we were helicoptered out from our base at Chu Lai, and you sat there on this sort of bald hill with bunkers on it and some artillery pieces, and you looked out at miles and miles and miles of jungle where there were whole divisions of NVA hiding out, and you felt fairly insignificant, and the company would walk off and then just sort of disappear down there. You might see them walking across a rice paddy, and then they were just lost in the vastness of the jungle. Yeah, and you from the beginning you kind of go, are we going about this the right way? How is our little unit going to come to grips with them? And in fact, usually they came to grips with us rather than the other way around, because they knew where we were. If we got deployed by helicopter, or even if we walked in. They had enough scouts around, and yeah, they'd been doing it for 20, 30 years and had things pretty taped.
Yeah, they'd fought the French and all that lot. And, as powerful as America is in jungle warfare, that's attritional. You had 50,000 guys there, or 50,000 died. I don't know what your top number in the bush, so to speak, was, but let's say it was 250,000 and maybe 200,000 South Vietnamese. You were probably up against 1 million or more on the other side. So as big as America was and as powerful, you were still on the second foot. Would you say that?
Yes, well, we had 500,000 men in country, I think, at the peak, but that was people who unloaded ships and loaded bombs and wore uniforms and typists and things. Our division should have been, I should say, something like just around 20,000 men, but we fielded 3 infantry brigades, some artillery, but the companies and then there were like 3 battalions per brigade, and when you started counting it up, it was like the RLI towards the end of the war. You weren't fully manned. If you should have had 150 men in a company, but if you had 100, you were pleased, and if you had 70, you still weren't doing too bad. With attrition, sickness, people rotating out. So during my first tour there, we had 4 rifle squads in a platoon, but maybe mention later again. On my second tour, we had 2 squads, each one with a machine gun, the M60 rather than MAG. And if you had 12 men in 2 squads, in each of 2 squads, that was doing okay then. You ask about attitude, and I must say most of the draftees would rather have been somewhere else. But I couldn't really complain because I brought it on myself, and I thought we were doing the right thing. Well, I still think we were trying to do the right thing, even if we went about it in a very poor manner at times.
Yeah. Well, I think it was the right thing at the time. Obviously it was sad the way it ended. But if America hadn't helped Korea, South Korea wouldn't be there today. And yeah, it was a time to fight the old commies. Um, Talk us through some of the action you saw, Ed. What did you actually experience there?
Well, I started off as an assistant gunner and then as a M60 machine gunner, despite the fact that I was one of the smaller guys. Yeah, we would set off on a patrol. Sometimes we'd hit mines or booby traps, but they were usually fairly fresh because they saw us coming and they were just delaying us so that we didn't catch up with them. We had a fair number of sniping incidents, and at one stage we had a sniper and somebody with an M79 grenade launcher, and they shadowed us for a week. And you'd hear a pop and a bang and call for medic, and you'd be, then you'd have to secure the landing zone, get a medevac helicopter in, and maybe load a couple extra people that had been hit while you were doing that. So they very often kept us on the back foot, and we were reacting. You'd catch fire, you'd call in artillery, you'd call in gunships. But as I say, they had lots of practice and knew what they were doing. And I don't mean this in any derogatory way, but they were totally different kettle of fish than the opponents in Rhodesia.
Mm.
And they were in for the duration, and they knew it. So when they went south from North Vietnam, they knew they had to defeat the American Round Eyes and their running dog collaborators, and reunify Vietnam. And they would hold positions, and you had to kill each one individually, or just keep bombing and calling in artillery until they got tired and left. But it was very unsatisfying generally.
And running parallel with that, you were right up at the DMZ. DMZ, as Americans pronounce it. Sort of plugging away at them, but running down your left flank from Laos all the way down into southern Vietnam was this massive train of troops and artillery and material, and that corridor of troops. And so you fighting up there must have been like trying to empty a bath with a teaspoon while the taps were running. I'm surprised Laos never really got taken over or invaded by America.
There were incursions later in the war, but they were not terribly successful, as they were after the so-called Vietnamization of the war, and they were spearheaded by Vietnamese troops, though a lot of Americans were involved. The first one in the south went into Cambodia, and that was somewhat successful. But the one that went into Laos, that was really Indian country, and the long-range recons and SOG people that went in there. You just kind of read a book about the whole call signs being deployed and then just never being heard from again. They could just vanish into the jungle, and the North Vietnamese would pick them up and track them down, sometimes with dogs, but they were good at tracking as well. And so that was the closer you got to the Laotian border, which was west of our area of operations. We got close to it a few times. It started catching artillery fire and things, but we were actually on the Marines had the major function up there on the demilitarized zone, and after that Dong Ha operation, we were just south of them. We were the northernmost army unit.
Good Lord, it must have been like sticking your hand into a bunch of hornets. What was the scariest moment that you had, Ed?
I didn't like going into tunnels, but because of my size, it kind of fell to me to do some of that type of work. In theory, you would then take one of these Ruger 22s so that you didn't blow your eardrums out, but somebody'd always pinch them back in the rear areas. So you went in with a ep385 and one of these government issue crook neck flashlights that you would go down and then you'd have to bang it on the wall of the tunnel or something to get it to come back on. So, if anybody, I never went into a tunnel where there was opposition because there were tunnels everywhere. And some of them would be trapped with all kinds of ingenious things. But luckily, I didn't encounter those. But just the confinement and the crawling around a corner and not knowing what was you were going to come face to face with on the other side, I didn't like that at all.
Wow, just to go into a tunnel, because you don't know there's no opposition until you know there's no opposition. That takes balls of steel. I would have been too big to go down one, but I wouldn't have had I wouldn't have had the guts to do it. So I take my hat off to you. They dug thousands of miles of tunnels, didn't they?
I mean, down in some areas, they were tunnels running right under major U.S. military bases. But again, in our area, it wasn't so much of that. It was mostly above ground. Even their base camps were above ground. But the soil just lended itself to tunneling. You didn't have to put supports in unless you were going to make a great hospital or something underground, which they did. And they at times, and there were whole battalion or divisional headquarters just inside a hill.
Sorry, but basically you were fighting a coin war, counterinsurgency, and a conventional war, because they attacked with tanks and all sorts of things. That's a real tough thing to fight, isn't it?
I think one of the most soul-destroying things, of course, and something that made big headlines, were some of the hill attacks. There'd be a mountain with it. They'd entrench themselves. They'd fortify it. They'd have internet-connected, mutually supporting bunkers all set up, and then they'd go out and ambush an American squad, and then they'd ambush platoon came to their rescue, and then they'd sort of envelop a larger group, and then they'd disappear. So they came from the hill. You'd go up the hill, and yeah, some of the most famous engagements in Vietnam were these, in the end, futile attacks on fortified hilltops, where you lost lots of people, you helped feed the anti-war movement, and you got up there and you found some body parts, and but everybody you could walk had gone away, and they'd gone back into Laos or something.
And then for reasons at a higher level than you have all those guys killed, capturing that hill, and then you don't occupy it. You just go away, and Hill 868 or something I read about, dozens of men lost going up there, and then you don't occupy it, you don't hold the ground, and they just come back a week later.
Exactly. It was one of the soul-destroying things. You'd lose people, you'd get to the top of the hill, you'd look around, and then you were either told to walk yourself off, or that you were being uplifted by helicopters and taken somewhere else. But just on the helicopter thing, you see in the Vietnam movies, there's always these swarms of helicopters. But I felt right at home in Rhodesia, because we had a standing joke in our division. What's a company? How many helicopters does it take for a company-sized combat assault? One helicopter making 10 trips.
Yeah, brilliant. And to sort of close the Vietnam experience, when you got back to the States, was the rejection of the Vietnam soldiers as bad as it's been made out, or did you just feel totally rejected?
Well, I did 2 tours in Vietnam. I got there in July, and I was shot up on 1st of November, and then in hospital for a month, and when I got back to America that time, it was still, there was anti-war sentiment, but it wasn't terrible. I volunteered to go back to Vietnam in July, August of '69. And by the time I came back in '70, then yeah, you were unpopular, so you let your hair grow and tried to blend in.
How did you get injured? It was set in an ambush.
Yes, in fact, the day previous, I'd walked point for the company. We'd got up onto a hill feature and then handed over to another platoon. And we came down this jungle choked re-entrant, and bumped into some North Vietnamese. Um, and when we got forward air control overhead, which they were flying what we called the Lynx.
Mm.
They spotted a base camp and fired some white phosphorus rockets into it, and then we went into this base camp. And because we were lost, we caught them off guard, and they were. It's the only time I saw them really lose control, command control, and we lost nobody, but we got quite a body count, which is what the brass were counting, and we captured a 75 recoilless and dozens of AKs and all the rest of it. The next day we did some sweeps, got some more body counts, including what I think was a Chinese doctor. He was carrying a Tokarev and had the right uniform on. And then we were delayed and moved off to our night logger quite late, moving very too fast to move tactically, using the same trail, violating many of the rules that you're taught, to the same night position that we'd used the last time we were in the area. And they had an ambush set for us. So a good part of my platoon was taken out, killed and wounded. And yeah, that was, it happened very quickly. The North Vietnamese they had spider holes dug in on the other side of a bamboo covered rock wall. They just pitched grenades over. And when we hit the dirt to get away from the grenade blasts, then they jumped up and sprayed anybody that was moving with their AKs. And we lost our platoon medic and a company medic. So there was, just one guy patching up the other one in the end there. Yeah, so that was one of those things that happens in an instant. You just kind of go, oh, a grenade came over, and then bang, and then suddenly you're shot. I happened to catch it in the middle of the chest, and it went into my right lung. And that
So
was.
your experience in Vietnam came to an end. How did you get over to Africa? What was the connection there?
Well, I read all the books of jungle adventures and watched the programs on Marlon Perkins and them. And I wanted to be a game ranger or a professional hunter. And while I was in Vietnam, I saw an advert for a hunt, a Tetsi, in Outdoor Life or one of those magazines, and got in contact with Peter Johnston, who ran Rossland Safaris. And gee, it was a place I could afford to go if I saved up my pennies. And I made staff sergeant, so I had a little bit more money and saved up. And I went to Rhodesia in September 1970 as Buona Safari.
And that was just to go on a hunt for get big game, was it?
Yeah, I shot elephant and sable and eland and leopard and those things. But the main thing is I got to see a bit of the country and meet the people, and basically fell in love with it. I felt at home immediately. And Peter Jones encouraged me and said, well, why don't I, if I like it, why don't I just come over and live there? And things were very peaceful comparatively peaceful in 1970.
Mm.
So, it looked like, quite a good thing to do.
And so what job did you commence? in his business, did you?
Well, I went back to America and then the Bahamas and worked there for a while, um, and only went back to Rhodesia in January of '73. And I tried national parks, but they said, no, they're only hiring Rhodesians and South Africans, sorry. But I did get on with Tipsy Control. And they say, what experience do you have? I go, well, I just got out of the army a little while ago. And they say, we'll send you up to join Dave Madgen and the boys up in Darwin, Matoko, in Nyanga North area. So I immediately went into a low-scale war situation again, which wasn't what I was really looking for. You know, I thought this was this nice, peaceful country.
And that was in Tsetse control, was it?
Yes. Yeah, we were based down on the Rhodesia. That was our base, about 100 meters from the Portuguese East Africa border, as it was known then. But we spent most of our time working north of the Mazoe, well, north of Nyamapanda, up that way on spraying operations, and worked with the troops, whoever was based at Rishinga. We had first RIR because we were pushing back the tsetse fly and protecting the national herd, so we were a priority. And so we had first RIR guarding our camps and helping us out. And then when the SAP took over Rishinga, then we had an SAP presence with us. At the end of the spraying, as the spraying season came to an end, realized I wasn't any closer to becoming a game ranger or a professional hunter. And then our senior officer was blown up on a mine below Rishinga there, and I thought, I need to rethink this and regroup.
I bet you did. You must have thought, Vietnam Part 2, what the heck am I doing here?
Yeah, spraying DDT wasn't what I wanted, and so I wasn't getting anywhere because Pepsi and national parks had an agreement that they wouldn't poach each other's staff, so you couldn't transfer over. You had to quit one organization and join the other one. So I spent a year back in the Bahamas, well, 11 months on a security contract, and then went back, tried again, and got on with national parks. My Pepsi experience stood me in good stead, and also we were people getting thin on the ground.
What was it you liked about Rhodesia and the Rhodesian people? Were they just similar to what you had back home, or what was it, do you think?
It's hard to pin it down, but I'm very fortunate that at a time in my life, I just went someplace and immediately felt at home, even though they drove on the wrong side and things like that. It was an affinity for the people. I was immediately handling big gangs of people, so I got a very quick introduction into the rural African and the way that things worked out in the bush.
There's just something about Africa, and that part of Africa in particular is just beautiful. Lovely people generally, easygoing, and yeah, it was great. I loved my life there. But how did that lead into tracking? What sort of experience that you had in tracking?
My first station was Wankie. It was based at main camp, and then in the Deca Safari area was based at a place called Mbala Lodge near Nkosi siding. And I spent 21 to 25 days a month patrolling with my scouts, following up poachers, doing problem animal control with elephant, but mostly anti-poaching. And I picked up tracking a fair ability. I'm not going to ever say I was a great tracker or a fantastic tracker. I wasn't. But I was competent because you were doing it every day. So it was towards the end of '76 that I joined the volunteer tracker unit. I was a permanent resident I registered with Defense Manpower and was going to have to do some call-ups. And as Parks had its own tracking unit, that seemed a logical thing.
So did your African trackers actually show you how to track? Did they demonstrate what you were looking for? Aerial spoor, fall of grass, shadows? Is that basically, did you have a formal course from them, or did you just pick it up?
No formal course. You picked it up. If they saw something and you go, "Ooh, well, what is this?" And they would explain of what they were looking at and how they picked it up. But a lot of it was just trial and error, and picking up the finer points by mistake. But one thing I say, the way the tracking units developed. Okay, I wasn't there in the early days, but I was told first, if the Army asked for some trackers, a couple game scouts would be sent to them. But they sometimes end up being treated as skivvies and just put on, fill those sandbags or dig this hole or something for me. And then also, if there was a contact, they were just left on their own, and they weren't trained soldiers. They didn't know, and if they suddenly popped up in the wrong place, they'd be shot by mistake. Especially if there was an all-white unit. It was, by the time I started, there were 2 officers and 2 game scout Africa trackers, and so you made up your own stick. You were a helicopter load. You were your own little unit, and sure, we pitched in and helped track at times, but our main function was really to look after the game scouts. They're the real trackers whose skill far exceeded ours. And so we made sure they were safe and tried to, and if we made contact, then we were our own little unit. And while everybody else did what they thought they had to do and forgot about us, which often happened, we could get, could protect ourselves and get on with life.
Yeah, obviously your experience in Vietnam contributed to that. Did you ever contribute any of your experience, something they might not have known?
Not in a significant way, except just combat experience, sort of sixth sense, the kind of there's something there, there's something wrong. Your trackers should be concentrating on the tracks as they should be, and sometimes you just go, well, it's too quiet, or those types of things. But yeah, just the fact that I'd been shot at and hit and shot at and missed was an advantage. It wasn't the first time. And my first call up was to Mount Darwin, and it wasn't the most successful of tracking call ups. We did a lot of tracking, but by that, I also found that tracking in a game reserve, one poacher, was a lot different than tracking in a farming area with thousands of people fumbling around and cattle being driven over the spoor and things. But we tracked people to the minefield. We tracked them until they just disappeared into a mass at a beer drink, and changed shoes, changed clothes, and things. So the heyday of tracking to contact had sort of passed by the time I got into it.
And did you have much success with the poachers? Could you talk us through maybe one event where you actually had an arrest and what the guy was trying to poach?
Well, along the north boundary of Wankie, it was mostly subsistence poaching, and I'd have a couple patrols out, donkey patrols, scouts still wearing their kepis in those days in the beginning, and they would go out, and then I would join them. And if they'd found snares, then we'd ambush the snares and wait for somebody to come along. And tracking into the TTLs wasn't a very profitable thing to do. You needed, even in those days, evidence that it was them, and for them disturb a snare, for instance, and then have them take it and then reset it or something like that.
Mm.
You know, to be able to give evidence like that in court was important. But then in fact, the first time we ever had a military radio, because we patrolled without radios at all. First time we had the military radio with us, we picked up a group of about 30 or so people who had been either abducted or had decided to join from Wankie from the mine,
Yeah.
and were being taken through Wankie National Park to the Botswana border. And we picked up those tracks, and we're lucky to be able to call it in and get one end up out there to get on the tracks with Ronnie Van Heerden, who was later my provincial warden.
And did they manage to stop them leaving the country?
They got close enough, they bombshelled. And yeah, there were people pitching up for the next week, starving and dying of thirst. And like in that original, was it Op Nickel, that one where the contact was in Nyantui. We were still picking up doppies from there, but there'd been other contacts down inside the park. And once you get into that flat Kalahari sand, if you lose your sense of direction there and you don't know where the next water is, you're in trouble.
Yeah, I operated in that area. It's not very nice at all. Psychologically, how did you reconcile being wounded in Vietnam? You didn't really want to fight that war, maybe, and then you're back in a war environment. How did you say to yourself, this is okay? I mean, had you fallen in love with a local lady and therefore there was more commitment, or what was it? What motivated you to stay?
I can't really say, except that was home now and that I was going to fight for that country. I didn't have a regular lady at that stage, so that didn't come into it. There were very few opportunities. It's the one fairly somewhat amusing incident occurred where after I'd been moved from Wankie to Chisarira, and Chisarira had been destroyed by the terrorists in late '76, and a lot of people had been abducted. And they were being taken by a boat across Lake Kariba when our water forces, can't remember exactly what to call it, but our boat people,
The BS, yeah.
fired them up, and some drowned and some made it to shore and things. But we, like Monopools, which was a fort, when I went there in '77, end of '77, we started building a fort, building bunkers, stringing razor wire, doing all those things that seemed quite familiar. But when I was transferred there, I had my own private vehicle, which had been mine protected. But then I kept adding things to the load. And so I ended up with a 44-gallon drum of petrol in the back. Would you mind taking these two cases of P4 and this old box of gelignite we don't need anymore, and these flares and these cases of ammunition? So my Land Rover was kind of almost standing on its tail by the time it was loaded. And when I met Pete Smith, one of the ground coverage guys, on the way to Chisarira, and knowing how many mines there were on the roads there, and he just kind of shook his head and wished me luck, but it was I made it. Chisarira had been abandoned for a while, but every scrap of the Tessie fence had been turned into snares by the locals. And though it was a no-go area, they still poach. And probably one of the most depressing parts of my career was just finding hundreds and hundreds of animals dead in snares. It was, a kind of soul-destroying thing, because you were just always a step behind, and it was difficult to travel around. Getting in and out was a problem, and so our extended patrols, you you couldn't, there were so few of us, you couldn't be everywhere at once. And so you'd find a snare line and you'd find 40 snares and you'd find hyenas and waterbuck and everything else, all Cottonese. So that wasn't a pleasant time.
No. And for people who are not familiar with the attempt to eradicate the tsetse fly, it's a fly that if it bit you would give you sleeping sickness, and it can be fatal, and it's terrible for animals as well. So the whole concept was to drive the fly further and further north to the Zambezi Valley, where there is still some today. And that's what you're involved in. Can you explain why there was fencing involved in that? Because essentially, if I know anything about it, you set up black hessian sacks that looked like a cow to fly, and you put poison on it, and then it dropped dead. But where did the fencing come involved, Ed?
Well, there were along the whole Zambezi Valley, the escarpment, beyond the escarpment, and along those areas, like there were 12-strand game fences, and you tried to keep the game and the tsetse fly that side, and the cattle on the other side. And if elephants broke through, then you would follow up and try to shoot them or drive them back. I did more of that later on after I was transferred to Marangora. And then once the war actually ended, we did a lot of work along the tsetse fences, trying to keep them intact.
Did you ever bump into any tours as a tracker with the national parks? Did you ever have a contact with any of them?
Yes, and yes and no. We because of the way we operated, if there were shots fired, we were looking after the trackers, and we expected our backup sticks to do that. But things started to go a bit pear-shaped when, after the first Viscount was shot down, we were doing a call-up with, I think it was 1RR at Bindura, and then we moved up to Kuroi and worked in the Urungwe TTL. And that was the call-up during which I was shot at the most. We went to a place called Mugunji, and working out of there, we did a call, and someone would say, okay, there's been a contact, there's people visual there, and you'd set off, but you rarely actually made it there. You'd get part way, and then it was, as they said, a liberated area. You'd see people, they're terrorists visual. You'd be hearing on the radio that they just attacked the Internal Affairs Patrol, and now you see them scurrying across the field, so you open fire on them. And so you would go to your original destination, you'd start following them and spend another day on that. Another time, a partridge stick was surrounded on a hilltop, and so everybody, had to go and rescue them from sort of overwhelming odds. And then we were on our way to another scene, and the ground coverage chap in front of us stopped to check his map, and we stopped in the middle of a kill zone. And so suddenly there was great banging off the side of this kudu, an armored vehicle that we were in, and he was wounded. His sergeant, was using RPT to return fire. We returned fire. My sergeant was firing at a guy who was trying to get a bead on us with an RPG, and I popped one of these 42 Zulus, one of those rifle grenades, off towards where the guys were hiding in the grass there. And when that exploded, they all jumped up and gapped. So that broke up the ambush. That was, okay, now, all right, let's follow them. And we got another backup stick there, and we set off, and were almost immediately told, no, it's a frozen area, turn around. There was a hodgepodge, or a kind of checkerboard of frozen areas where people were doing funnies and areas that we couldn't go into. If you tracked to one of those, you just had to laugh it off.
Excuse me. So that Kudu vehicle actually successfully withstood bullet strikes, which it was designed for. But thank the Lord. I don't know. I think somewhere towards the end of the war, they started to use armor-piercing rounds. But I guess an AK round wouldn't go through the side armor of that Kudu.
Well, yeah, there's lots of different stories about that and some embarrassing. I mean, that one worked fine. It had those screens on the side that were supposed to make the bullets lose stability and tumble a bit. But when one of the rangers at Chisarira was trying to instill confidence in our field range, our game scouts, and say, look, this, you can't shoot through this thing. You're safe in this. And he took it up with his FN and bang, and shot a hole straight through the side. So yeah, well, see, an AK wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But
yeah. I think
some of them
designed for AKs. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think they would have gone maybe through that one as well, but
yeah.
it didn't work as a confidence builder.
No, actually, that box of it was like wire with canvas over it. If I'm thinking of the correct vehicle, the Kudu, that was the equivalent of standoff armor on a tank. It would detonate the RPG-7 a foot away from the armor plating, and hopefully would have lost some of its impetus by the time that White Hawk tier reached the armor, and then it would bounce off, hopefully. But I wouldn't like to put it into practice.
Yeah, it worked with AK fire, but I wouldn't have wanted to try an RPG on it.
Good Lord. Yeah. So there you are, assaulting hills, Vietnam parallel, getting shot at. There must have been something in you that almost enjoyed it, Ed. Do you think, or was it just a work opportunity?
There was a military leaning in me, I must admit, and having a combination of being a game ranger and soldier sort of fitted both bills there. But as the war evolved, so our function also changed. We were having a few problems with our backup, shall I say, in that Urumqi area, and losing a bit of confidence that if we did get into a real jam, that there would be people who could help us get out. So it was a ruling made at CONOPS that we would only work with RLI. So our next call up was, we actually, and this showed how far things had gone by that stage. We were based up with 3 Commando on the Norton Golf Club range. And we got there, and moments later, before we had a chance to draw some hand grenades and some of the usual kit, there was, I think it was a police stick had been ambushed just over the mountains. So like, we jumped onto the helicopter, 2 minutes flying time away. We gave the Fire Force commander direction of flight, and then followed cautiously. But as we saw where somebody had split, and so we followed that one, and we got him while the main Fire Force element took care of the rest. From there, we went to Kuroi, and yeah, it was Major Snowgar told us then that, he said, look, we don't really need trackers. On Fire Force, we don't. And if you bring your black guys along, they'll probably get shot, because our guys, if they see a black chap with a rifle, they're used to working in all white sticks, they'll probably shoot them. So, but we were really short people. And if I was working with Ron here, my provincial warden then, said, but if you and Ron would like to join the sticks, just go in as troops, then we've got a job for you. Otherwise, you can just park off here, or you can go back to Salisbury. We don't. Otherwise, so we were absorbed into the commando. I was issuing a stick under Corporal Calloway, and it was, in a way, after doing so many tracking follow-ups and so many lemons, so many dead ends, so many, you track the contact and then they bombshell and everybody goes away, to actually work with a professional, really fine-tuned unit where you were going out to sightings, you were going out to contacts in progress, but usually it was somebody had them visual. And okay, there's been people who's gone into this coral complex, and you would swoop in, and that was probably the most satisfying part, because you were soldiering, and you knew who the enemy was. You were there. After that, though, we things changed again, because some of the older members said, "No, we're trackers. We didn't sign on to be troops." So while people like Oliver Coltman and I were uh, disappointed because we'd thought this was the good. It was getting towards the middle of '79 by that stage, and we told just we'll work on our own areas. There's nobody else there, So the Zambezi Valley outside Chirundu was really vacant, and so we just started patrolling, doing our call-ups in border areas.
But before you depart from the RLI story, you were actually deployed by helicopter, were you? In the Fire Force actions, were you?
Yes, yes. So it's
And
um,
describe one or two episodes that might have been interesting. What did you experience?
okay. Well, I'll use one which, as it ended up kind of strangely, it's kind of atypical. There was a sighting. We went out. We started to move in. We saw one uh, terrorist who was running through some high grass in front of us. Corporal Galloway and I opened fire on him. He went down. He contacted the K car, and that it was orbiting around it. Put a couple of 20 mils down there, and then there was this sudden explosion, and the K car commander goes, he just blew himself up. Okay, well, that's if they would all do that, it would make things easier. So we went up through some crawl complex, and we were working our way down another hill, the face of the hill, which had lots of ledges and little caves. And but the only way we were coming to the top, so you had to kind of turn and look around. And as I sort of peered in one cavity, I heard two grenade strikers pop, and I went, "Oh dear!" And I expected to have them land at my feet. The MAG gunner who was just next to me, he fired a burst in there, and we both kind of scrambled out of them, away from the mouth of the cave. But they, in fact, I don't know what the political commissar told them, but they must have told them that we would do terrible things to them because they'd committed suicide by grenade. And anyhow, we finished that sweep. We were uplifted to Jim Barker's farm. I don't know if you know or know of him.
Yes. Before you carry on about Jim, please, anybody watching this show, please buy his book on Amazon called Paradise Plundered. I think it is the go-to story from the farmer's point of view. Beautiful, beautiful book. Just what he went through, forming his own little fire force on his farm, his own fire base. Fantastic story. I've mentioned this before, but to me, it's the Hemingway of the bush wall. This have you got it there? Paradise. Hold it up a bit.
I've also got it.
Hold it up higher to be able to see the cover. Hold it up higher and hold it steady. Paradise Plundered. Wow, that's a new cover. Well, this was the cover I got. It was one of the original books, one of the first printed in Zimbabwe with some guy that was just a printer. But to me, it's one of the finest books written on the wall. Sorry, carry on with your story about Jim.
There's not any great long thing about that, is except in his book he mentions that particular incident when we had these terrorist commit suicide. And when we landed there and met the land trail, the bodies were left. Don't ask me why. And so they kind of laid there overnight. And so as he tells the story, as I recall it, the local terrorists thought that he had executed them or something. And so there was a big yaka about that with him. But he wasn't terribly happy with that.
Yeah, it's I mean, on that tower, this tower here, he actually had mortar tubes, and there are Barnes with his aeroplane. He cut a hole in the side and put a gun in it. So he faced a bit of flack from that what they thought was an execution. Mm.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact story, but you'll be able to find it in there. It's about that particular incident.
Yeah, and I think it became a Fire Force base at one point, if I remember from the book. But carry on with your story. Did you have anything else happen on Fire Force that you? But before you answer that question, from the sounds of it, you'd had no formal training of getting in and out of helicopters. I mean, the first time you did it, did you know what the heck you were doing? Did you just ask the guy next to you? How did that happen? It's quite odd to me.
Well, I've been on lots of helicopters, even if they were Hueys rather than Alouettes. And yeah, I knew my way around, and we'd done some training also when I was still at the Tekasfari area with RAR, and a bit of, in fact, there was a bit of formal tracking training, but we were actually helping. And some of my scouts also underwent. So I saw the routine of the Rhodesians used, which was basically the same, but just fewer people.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you ever see a Huey fly over in Rhodesia? If you had, your mind must have gone straight back to Vietnam, seeing it plop overhead.
Well, only when that first big external happened, took place. Um, don't, don't ask me the name of it, but when they hit Westland's Farm and all those other bases, and in fact, I've just been in touch with somebody who said he took the Pookie, which led the convoy down to Monopools, which was a staging area, at night with no lights and everything. And we heard, because Maribor, our houses were just above the road, so we heard all this rumbling of lorries going on. The next morning, we heard DACs and we heard helicopters, and we saw what looked like the entire Rhodesian Air Force fly over just to the west of us. So yeah, but I never actually rode on one of the Hueys in Rhodesia.
But you must have seen them. You must have seen them on that deployment over Kariba, hey?
Yeah.
Oh, what a mind warp! What a mind warp! It must have been a mind warp for you. I can't get
well,
it.
Still hearing them here, I mean, because they use some of the firefighting people and rescue people use old Hueys.
Yeah.
And you can, that two blade, that pop, 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 it makes a very distinctive sound.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. I spoke to one of my mates who went up in one, and he said the Alouette sort of staggered up in the air with four guys with packs, and this Huey just goes up like a lift in a building, and beautiful plane to fly in, aircraft. So I've dragged you away from, did you have maybe one other contact experience with RLI? Maybe you could describe a Fire Force action where you were dropped as a stop and you saw things going on. Do you have anything like that, Ed?
There was a bit of a difficulty at one of the Fubon places up north of Karoi. And that's not a Fire Force deployment, but we went as Fire Force went up there to see these AK toters and who were giving the authorities a bit of trouble there, and they calmed down quite quickly and faced by all these lads. But I think the funniest thing about doing that was the age gap, because I was 30 then, and the average age of a RLI trooper was probably about 18 or 19. And I just think of the community hall at Karoi where we were based up. Well, it was only half the commando there, and every radio and every cassette player doing something else, and guys cleaning weapons or snoring or doing this and that, and then going doing rifle drill or something. But yeah, I thought at the time, having reached 30 and having already been in one war, how are these lads going to readjust? Because in Vietnam, we weren't in contact daily. It's like being a pilot, long periods of boredom between moments of share. But with those guys, they were doing it every day, day after day. And I've got some good friends here who were, Des Archer, who was one commando and I think did the most combat parachute jumps ever.
That's right. I think it was 73 or 75 combat jumps. And not just going out once a day, but 2-3 times a day, hey?
Yeah, he just lives around the corner from me. I mean, he was my boss for a while at Maputoland when I started the Tembe Elephant Park here in South Africa.
Ed, before you carry on, please speak to Des about the possibility of being interviewed. I'm not sure out of the 300 that we've done whether he's one of them, but I'd love to interview that man. I mean, he set a world record. And it's not about bragging this channel, but that's an historical biggie that I'd love to record. So if you could remember to ask him, I'd really appreciate it.
I'll ask him, but I think somebody already has, and he declined. But I can remind him.
Ask him again and tell him you've done a talk and it wasn't that bad. So you never know.
Okay.
You might just
I don't know how bad this is because I haven't seen the product.
No, it's going to be great. It'll be great. I promise you. It's very interesting. Don't sell short what you're telling us. It's a fascinating story. So I have a tendency of butting in when people are talking and then they get lost in what they're saying. But you'd reached a point where you were now a grandfather of 30. You were tired of, they'd basically said to you, we don't need trackers anymore. And the old guys wanted to move out. Where did you go from the RLI?
You mentioned that we started working just in our own areas, mostly the Zambezi Valley, and some of the other chaps worked down Gonarozo or Wankie. So there was plenty of area to go around. I mean, I'd caught a wake up when I linked up with 3 Commando at Norton, and you could see the lights of Salisbury in the distance. And you thought then, we're in trouble here. But kind of degressing or just going sideways, thinking of Jim Barker and his farm, that he was organized, and he gave us a tour. He gave me and Ronnie Van Heerden a tour of his facility. I could call it that rather than just a house. But then one of our jobs, we were still doing nature conservation work at the same time. And so we would get calls about problem animals, mostly lion, killing cattle. And I don't know whatever happened to them, but this chap, Mr. Tauti, I remember, he phoned very apologetically and said, look, most of his cattle have been stolen, his labor's been abducted, his barns have been burnt down, he's been attacked so many times, and the few cattle he's got left are being eaten by lions. Can we please help? So I went off there, and I'm not saying this in a derogatory way. It was sort of it looked to be a marginal operation. It wasn't like Jim Barker's. There was the house, and the few remaining cattle were in a little kraal right attached to the house. But I arrived there with 5 or 6 game scouts, like the one photograph, I have of some standing in front of a kudu. That was actually us leaving as we left to go to Omega Farm was the name of it. Being a young guy, and you've always got a weapon, and you've got some field rangers, or you've got other rangers around you, and you're feeling like you can take care of yourself. And going to Omega Farm opened my eyes to what the small farm I was going through during the war, because they'd be attacked, and the wife would have a shotgun at the one side of the house, and he'd have his police reserve or FN at the other side, and his mother, who must have been 85 or so, was loading magazines for him. And the evening I arrived, and she said, "You don't know what it's like to have you here." Yeah, it was enough to bring tears to your eyes, or tears to my eyes now thinking about it. Because they were really stuck out by themselves. And I say, I don't know whatever happened to them. The lions were very wise. I ended up having to poison them. But the kill was right next to the main Salisbury Shirley Road. And they'd eaten and crossed the road. So I had to call in and say, okay, well, I'm going to follow the tracks across the that frozen area. I can only assume that they died, though I hated using poison. But sometimes going to some other farms, we were only called after everybody else had failed. So the farmer and then some of his friends or had to go at these lions and maybe wounded one, or maybe tried to poison them, but hadn't got it right, and they would never come back to a kill. So they became almost unkillable. They were very wise lions, and I spent many a frustrating day just trying to track them along riverine thickets and stuff, with very little success, because they were wise to the game. That was, some of the.
Did you ever get them, Ed?
Well, not those particular ones I'm thinking of. Just again, kind of sidetracked. My nickname to the Tongas and Zulus up in northern KwaZulu, they couldn't pronounce Ostrosky, so they called me Oshkosh because they knew the truck. But there was a terrorist leader in the Karoi area named Oshkosh, and that was his war name. And we tried to get him, and well, everybody tried to get him and failed. But when I was trying to doing line control on one property, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but it was a bigger farm, and it was. I can't believe what happened. His Induna had disappeared during the war, and he thought, he'd been abducted and killed. And then he pitched up one day, and just said, "What is it?" No, he went. He went and joined the terrorists, and he says, "You might have heard of me, because I was called. They called me Oshkosh." So.
Did he become a member of the Silly Scouts after that?
No, this is at the end of the war, and
Oh, right. Good Lord, eh?
He was the guy said, "Okay, well, I'll take you back," and so he took him over as Induna, and then at that stage, certainly, he was one of the few that wasn't having political problems, because his Induna had been quite at the forefront of the tourism in the Karoi area. Yeah. So he had connections in ZANU-PF.
So at some point you left national parks and went tracking for other units, did you? Or if I got that wrong, reading your synopsis?
I did break service and just did some supply work in Botswana after Chisarira. But no, while I was in Rhodesia and in Rhodesia and Zimbabwe, because I stayed on until 82. Well, the volunteer tracker unit just died without ceremony or notification. Of course, us being civilians, we didn't have any. Nobody had to. Everybody felt they had to tell us, but it would have been nice if there'd been some sort of little notification saying thanks, but you're no longer required.
This seemed to happen a lot at the end of the war. Whole units just handed their rifles in, and half the time they weren't even told. I can't even remember what I did with my rifle or my equipment. It just was gone. And that was it.
Well, because we were still patrolling and doing things, I mean, I kept my FN. And maybe two things that one I skipped over and one that kind of comes afterwards. While we were doing our call-ups in the valley, was after the big Monopools attack, the longest sustained attack. I know Steve Edwards and Mike dealt with that, but Monument here deny we were doing a patrol along the Ecotone where it went into the Mopani, and I saw something glint in the sunlight and crept up, and it was a sardine tin with acrylic writing on it, and yeah, it looked pretty fresh. So I had a minor heart attack, thinking that because there was some thick bush ahead, but it had been their little TB or temporary base before the attack and maybe after the attack. Well, in fact, after the attack as well, because there were a lot of kind of bloody bandages and bits and pieces left around. A mortar tube, very nice little 60mm Chinese mortar tube, and mysteriously a complete dinner service.
Good Lord.
And I could only think that there were some sort of political commissars and stuff who were going to celebrate when they had wiped out this little garrison at Monopools and have nice dinner on their china. But that's something I could never really explain.
When you say Steve Edwards has described this talk, is it on one of the Fighting Men Rhodesia episodes?
I'm sure he talked about it, and Mike Bromwich may have well.
Steve Edwards. I must go back and have a look at that. How long did that attack last for?
It was still light in the evening when they started getting fire, 14.5s and stuff from across the river, and then there was a B-10 recoilless rifle and an 82 mortar somewhere. But the attack, including a fairly determined ground attack at one stage, lasted most of the night. But luckily, there was a VTU stick with Ollie Coltman and who were there, so there were a few more. And I think there was some national servicemen as well, extra. So they withstood it quite easily. It was a nice, solid little building. But it would have been a different story if they'd got even a couple of those 82 mortars inside, because it was a small area. I know Mark Butcher was there and some of the other guys, but I do have the information because I wrote a little something on that. I don't have it at hand.
So your Rhodesia experience, because of the amount of time we've been talking as well, your Rhodesia experience came to an end. You did a bit of time in Zimbabwe until 82. Was that experience enjoyable, or did you get hassle from the authorities in Zimbabwe?
Before one of the assembly points, Papa Camp, was at the old Ecology Research Station next to the road, well, not far from the road to Mana. So that was a bother and concern, both from security and poaching aspects. Ken Jones, he was on patrol up near there, and he bumped into some Zipper from Papa Camp, and they said, "Oh yeah, they'd shot a couple of impala and they'd wounded this rhino." So the following day, Ollie Coltman sent Ken and Andy Gibson and Nevin Leesnay along to look for the rhino, and this is after the war, but they were ambushed. But they debussed and returned fire, and they killed one and captured one. I think there was another wounded, but that's when you had several thousand people in that camp there with sort of some of their I think they had a few armored cars there and 14.5s, all kinds of things.
Mm.
But and I was sitting blissfully down at one of the pools until somebody said, "You better get inside the fort until we find out what's going to happen." But anyhow, that was the police and COMOPS dealt with that, and talked them out of doing anything. Except they did lay one landmine, which water affairs hit instead of us.
And you say that was after the war? Was that after April the 18th, when Zimbabwe was born?
Yeah, well, it was while Papa Camp, while it was after the ceasefire. I couldn't give you the exact date on it, but it's it was well after the ceasefire and after April, because I was still, being a good game ranger. My first job after the war was to clear all the mines off the roads in the valley. And we started off with a bookie, but it broke down immediately. And so we did 90% of the roads and hunting tracks in the valley with a couple SADF handheld detectors.
Good Lord.
But most of the vehicle mines on the roads had been set off by elephant. So you'd find the pile of bones or just a crater, and you knew that some poor elephant had a leg blown up badly or something.
Mm.
In fact, I wasn't in the business of lifting mines. That's not something within my pay grade. So all I did was, if there was something there, sketch it. Okay, blow it in place. Just put some NT on top of it and blow it. In fact, just at the beginning, right at the start where we started our operation, and right at the end down in the Maquis River, were the two intact anti-vehicle mines that we found.
I think let's bring it to an end on your Rhodesia and Zimbabwe experience. If you could spend 5 or 10 minutes just telling us what happened after that. You went into South Africa. Could you give us an overview of what you did there?
Well, you'd already asked about if I was hassled by the authorities in any way. I did have one run-in with the National Army, but that luckily didn't develop into a shoot-up, because you were in sort of a no-win situation. Even if you won the contact, you would not win after that. And then one day, a chap in different camo arrived, and I said, "Oh, well," I was doing usual admin, and he said, "No, he's so and so from 88." Sorry, is that? He was being very polite. Is that some new battalion or unit or something? He says, "No, I'm from 88." And when I was still looked blank, he said, "No, 88 Manica." And then I twigged. It was the ZANU PF headquarters. So he was up there to investigate me. And he was, in fact, it backfired on the Game Scouts or whoever had said I wouldn't let them have cock girls because I hated ZANU PF, and that was their symbol. And I wouldn't let them smoke tobacco and a few other things. But he actually was supportive in his own way. And but then not long after that, I was doing a boat patrol down from Chirundu to Mana. And I went into the member in charge's office at Chirundu, and he had been beaten to a pulp by the customs and immigration Romanian trained chappies there, while his own sergeant had held him. And and of course it was his fault because pale skinned. Yeah, so it was, there I was drifting down the Zambezi River with elephants and hippos and whatever. And I just thought, no, well, tomorrow that's me. And that's what made me decide to leave.
If you could give us a few minutes on what happened in South Africa after all of that.
My intention was to go back to America, because I thought, no, Africa's had its share of my sweat and tears and things. And but then some friends who were working at Pilanesberg said, "I mean, you can't leave and not hear lions roaring and elephants." So they steered me towards KwaZulu. And at that stage, you couldn't work directly for KwaZulu, one of the semi-independent homelands. You had to be taken on by cooperation and development and seconded. So I went through the chicken and egg thing there about you can't have a residence permit until you've got a job, and you can't have a job until you've got a residence permit. But I finally got through that, and with good support from the chief minister, late created an elephant park. I did the negotiations for the Tembe Elephant Park up in northern Maputo, right smack on the Mozambique border. And I ran that for 17 years before the amalgamation took place with the Natal Parks Board, and I was moved to Nkuzi, and then being restructured out of the organization, I took over field training and firearms. So I spent the rest of my time as head of the field training and firearms unit, what's better known as Isabella KZN Wildlife.
Wow. And that must have been a lovely place to live up in the north there. You obviously had your own house and everything must have been lovely.
It was, yeah, the other reserves I'd worked in Rhodesia, I was always filling somebody else's shoes. There'd always been somebody else there before. But I started Tembe from scratch, from fencing to introductions to the housing, to water supplies. And I was very lucky at that stage to have money and support, as I say, from the CM and the director to get on with the job. And I had other incidents there with armed poaching gangs and things like that. But that's another story, I think. But it wasn't a war situation, so if you pulled the trigger and there was blood on the ground, then there was a case of murder or attempted murder to answer. And you suddenly were being read your rights, and that I never get used to that.
Wow, so that must have been quite an idyllic life, really, hey? Fishing and game stuff must have been marvelous.
Well, I think the fishing side isn't really me, but it went from the elephants had been so harassed. They'd been shot at and wounded since the Portuguese landed in Maputo or in Lorenzo Marques. And so they were all the bulls certainly were carrying lead, and they'd lost parts of their trunks and had snares around their legs. So for quite a few years, it was either fight or fly. They didn't enjoy people, and some of them had learned quite efficiently how to deal with you. So we did a lot of crop protection, going into fields at night and trying to chase elephants away, which was a never-ending thing until we got the reserve electric fence. And
would you say that part of national parks in South Africa is still well looked after, or is it crumbling? Are there poachers coming back in and all that type of thing?
Well, certainly rhino poaching has not been a happy story. At Tembe, all the talk was range expansion. We were putting rhinos, black rhino and white, everywhere we could to spread the danger and the load. But my son works in Kruger, and we visit there, and they've certainly had a massive problem. But the same syndicates are involved, so they can be in Mpumalanga and Mpopo one day, and they can be in KZN the next.
Mm.
And the disadvantage at KZN, of course, is that the reserves are smaller, so you can shoot a rhino and be out in your BMW or Hilux or something, and be on your way back to Joburg or Richards Bay. By the time a follow-up can be organized, I mean, there's guys trying there. They've had their successes, but as one of the ranger said to me when I was doing a bit of work for Peace Parks, he says, "Mr. Ostrosky, it's a holding action. We're just hoping something will happen. We don't know what it is, but we're hoping something will happen."
Well, the most beautiful, captivating scene I've ever seen in the wildlife was at Shishlui, where there were 8 lions in this massive tree with branches, and directly below them were 4 rhinos. It just, I mean, every car in the park had just stopped, and I got out to photograph it so I could have had some evidence, and my camera battery was dead. But
right.
that was just such a beautiful scene. And, you know, to lose that beauty is absolutely evil. There's nothing short of evil.
Yeah, they haven't really started. I mean, there's subsistence poaching, but you know, at Tenby, there's still a good. I call him a lad. He's 50-something years old now, but he's still a lad to me. I mean, there's a good lad there in charge, and there's just no budget for staff.
You froze for over 30 seconds there. You said somebody was still a lad. Ed, I think we're gonna have to end it here. It's been a very interesting talk, and I want to thank you for coming on board. And I'd like to thank you for your service to our country. I will quite happily call you an honorary Rhodesian, which I do to any person who fought for Rhodesia. So that's the accolade you can have from us, at least. But thank you for coming and giving us an idea of what you went through. It was wonderful talk.
Okay, thank you for having me, and well, I hope that when you look back at this and edit it, that you have something.
Oh yes, John does a very good job at editing, so it'll turn out nice. Where we speak slowly, he speeds it up and all sorts of stuff and links things together. So yeah, once again, thank you very much, and all the best for the future.
Thank you very much.
Okay, God bless. Bye-bye.